I'd like to refresh you with a phrase that when I first heard, it really sold me on the Buddha Dharma. It moved me to my core. And that phrase is very simply dedicated to the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. When I first heard that phrase, I just felt like I would never forget it. I felt like it was one of the most potent and powerful statements that one could make to dedicate all of one's efforts to the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. But what's interesting about that phrase is, for as beautiful and as meaningful it is for all of us to hear in the beginning, eventually we have to learn actually exactly what it means. We have to actually define these terms. And that can be difficult to do because we live in such an insulated situation. For most of us, even though we are connected through all of the media and all of the ways in which we interact with other people, still the most important people in our lives generally are our family and our friends. And when we think of the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, unfortunately, we tend to think of mostly of those beings for whom we have the greatest concern. And there is a forgetfulness that comes over us, and we are not able to really commit ourselves wholeheartedly and impartially as we should, with each of us trying to adhere to the principles of the Bodhisattva's way of life. So here we are, concerned with the welfare of all beings, and yet not really understanding what all beings actually are. We think of all beings as being all humans on this planet. We think that sometimes we forget and think that we're the only species on this planet. Even where other beings are visible, we simply forget how to look at them. We almost put ourselves in a position where we're a little bit blind, or we have blinders on, thinking that humankind is the most significant and most important of all beings. Those of us who love animals may include our pets in that number, and we may include other animals that we favor. But the real meaning of that most potent phrase, the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, goes far beyond the extent that I've just described. It isn't just one's own family. It isn't just one's own friends. It isn't just one's own country or culture. It really, if we were to follow truly what the Buddha has taught, isn't even our own planet only. Because Lord Buddha taught us that there are 3,000 myriads of universes. And I would imagine that was a conservative estimate. And that in these 3,000 myriads of universes, there are many dimensions of reality, both physical and non-physical. The Buddha taught us that there are non-physical dimensions where beings are experiencing different kinds of experiences so alien to us that we could not possibly understand. And we are also taught that there are what are called higher realms of beings where demigods exist, and one experiences a very godlike existence. But it's hard for us to recognize that because we are so isolated and so habituated towards seeing ourselves as the center of the universe, seeing ourselves as the most important factor. Unfortunately, if we continue with that kind of habit, we can't really develop the universality that is implied by the Buddha's teaching. It's as though we become concerned for our little affairs, our little wars, our little hungers, our little desires, and we forget about the others. It has become, unfortunately, acceptable for certain religions to favor their own kind of people and their own kind of culture and not others. I would hope that as Buddhists we will not become one of those. I would hope that our depth would be more than that. I would hope that the extension of our attention would be more than that. Actually, because of cultural bias and I would have to say species bias, we must remind ourselves and sensitize ourselves that we are not the only living creatures. And that takes something of a deliberate effort. And it may seem to us like, well, intellectually we know that there are other species, we know that this is a big world, we know that there are other cultures, so why do we bother with this? It would seem as though that might not be so important, or it might be a waste of time. I couldn't disagree more. I couldn't disagree more. I really feel that in order to work diligently, and here's where you have to determine if you are really working sincerely, determinately, and diligently towards what the Buddha has taught, this kind of impartiality and universal compassion and concern for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, that in order to truly accomplish that, we have to put some effort into it, into that specifically. Because our tendencies have been influenced by our own habitual tendency and the way that we were raised. The world has changed a lot, even in just the last 50 or 20 years, even the last 10 years. So, in this day and at this time, particularly practicing as we practice, really I think anyone who is on a spiritual path must begin to think this way, must require of themselves to think this way. But particularly I'm concerned that we as Buddhists practice this universality and do so diligently and well, so that within our minds, piece by piece, brick by brick, we are able to knock down the walls of distinction between oneself and others. So that our compassion and our concern is not partial, so that it's not limited, so that we understand the depth and breadth of the samsaric condition, so that we have an empathy for all creatures that live, and so that we do not allow ourselves to remain in a kind of supremist position or central position or isolated position or ivory tower position where we think of ourselves as really the most important factor. You know, that's natural for children. Children are like that. Children feel until they mature that the entire universe revolves around them. But if by the time we are adult, or perhaps in midlife, or perhaps getting old or long in the tooth, by that time, if we haven't kicked that habit, there's a problem. And unfortunately, you have only to listen to the conversation and intelligence of many of us for about 5 minutes, many people on this earth, many beings, and you'll find that that's exactly what's happened. Nobody's lost that habit. We seem to think that we are the center of the universe. And yet the Buddha teaches us that all sentient beings are equal. Logically, that would imply that, first of all, it is advisable and it behooves us to accumulate or attain the sense of impartiality and equanimity. But at the same time, it also teaches us, beyond our spiritual responsibility to practice in a certain way, it also teaches us that while all sentient beings are equal, there are many more of others than there are of ourselves. There's one of me, even in this room. If I were to profess concern for others, I would have to take the comfort and the well-being, the liberation and salvation of these sentient beings over my own. Not because I think of myself less. This is not a false humility trick. This is not a, gee, isn't she a good girl trick. It's pure and simple reasonableness. It's logical that the needs of the many would outweigh the needs of the one. And so there is this spirit of impartiality and generosity that we need to develop. And how can we do that? It's questionable that it will happen naturally in this day and time. I've had an interesting experience recently as I have relocated to make my home for the most part of the year in Arizona. And making my home there is interesting because you move from one section of the United States, and it's just one country, to another section entirely of the United States where the flavor of these two places is quite different. And where you can tell how we think is in seeing the difference in the newspapers in two different places. I'm sure many of you have noticed that when you've gone to different places. There is a certain preoccupation that we have here in the Washington area. The government is here, so we tend to think a little bit more nationally. But we also have a tremendous amount of local politics and gossip and blah, blah, blah that's going on, plus our everlasting fascination with royalty in other countries and movie stars in all countries and all that sort of thing. But there is a particular flavor to our newspaper here, and then when you go to a different state that is so much different from ours, you see that there is a different flavor there entirely, and what takes precedence there is the local flavor news. You know, the news that affects that part of the country and how it enters into that part of the country, how they think about things is so very different from here. Here, the newspaper responds to a people that are, that a good percentage of them are actually involved in something political. And the rest of us are at least exposed to it a great deal because of where we live. And in Arizona, well, they're talking about different stuff out there. In fact, I wonder if they're not running out of hard news in Arizona or something like that. It's pretty interesting. But if these kinds of differences, the flavor is so different, and if the kind of disconnection is so different between the D.C. area and the state of Arizona, if the way things influence these people is so different, if the way they see themselves is so different, and you've only to pick up the paper to see that it's different, then how much more so must it be throughout the world? Now, when we as visitors go to other parts of the world or even other states, what's the first thing we notice? The differences. It's the first thing we notice. I remember as a little girl moving from Brooklyn down to Florida and thinking, these people can't talk. And more than that, they can't dance. I couldn't figure it out. I thought, what was this? Completely different reality. They listen to different music. They wear different clothes. So different, even from one state to another. And both of these are on the eastern seaboard. So experiences like that give us the opportunity to discover exactly how isolated and self-absorbed we are on an individual, on a group, and on a cultural level. So when we pray for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, how deep is that actually going? There's a little glitch that happens, I think, inside our minds. It's as though when we pray for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, we think of that kind of person that's so easy to pray for. The one that looks like your people. You know? the one that looks like the guys you hang out with, the one that looks like what you grew up with. It's so much easier to imagine taking all of them into your heart and practicing sincerely for them, and forgetting that we are part of a universe. World citizens, let alone universal citizens. And it's hard to remember that all sentient beings are exactly equal according to the Buddha. In our nature, we are the same. That what seems to distinguish us is an apparent reality on an individual level that is actually a delusion. That is actually based on some sort of false conceptualization. That is based on the interplay of the five senses. Yet in our nature, we are inseparable. If somehow right now we could shed individuation and delusion and see with spiritual eyes rather than the way that we are perceiving right now, we would not be able to determine where one ended and another began. And yet, our perceptual world takes on the image like a movie screen being projected of our mind stream and therefore our habitual tendencies. We have the habit of thinking of self-nature, conceptualizing self-nature to be inherently real. Having the idea of self-nature as real, we are constantly obsessed with what's that and what's me, separating self from other. Being constantly obsessed with separating self from other, our first knee-jerk reaction is to determine whether we react toward other with hope or fear. Because whenever there is something else in the world besides us, the only relevance it has to us is how it affects us. Therefore, whatever thing or object or person or food or music or whatever we perceive, there's that knee-jerk attention to our reaction. And when we meet a person, our first thought, whether it's conscious or not, is this good? Do I like that? Hope or fear? Will I get approval, connection, attention from that person? Or is that person the enemy? It's like that. These are our automatic ways of thinking. They happen much quicker than we can possibly imagine. By the time we realize we've thought that, it's already happened. It's already happened. And so, sometimes, is there any hope? How are we going to pull down these fences? If the Buddha has taught us that we should gain the quality of impartiality towards all beings, how in the world is that going to happen when our own fundamental perception tricks us out of it every time? How are we going to do that? Well, the first thought that I have, and I'm sure you can agree with this if you think about it, is that it probably isn't going to happen accidentally. Isn't that the truth? I mean, if you think about it that simply, it's just not going to happen accidentally. And we here have the habit of waiting for our spiritual path to take. It's as though we have these ideas of magical formulas. If I practice for 10 years, then this will happen. But there's no, say, while you're practicing, you might want to change. Say, while you're being spiritual, you might want to get a little deeper about it. You might want to actually walk your talk. You might want to actually interface your path with your life. This is a theme that I've been harping on a lot but it's something that we seem to be missing. And I have to tell you that in my earlier life, that was my main complaint with religion, because I saw that happen so much. The habit really is that people will, go to church or go to temple or wherever as we go, and be together and sing the 6 songs that you're supposed to sing together every Sunday, or whatever it is, the passages that you have to go through and the different readings or so forth. And then we go home, and it's like we're going home from the mall. It's that deep. Say, I'm coming home from the mall, I've done a lot of window shopping, and I came home with one little goodie or something, And it's kind of like that, the way we treat our religions. We go home and we go to our church and our temple, we've done a lot of window shopping. We kind of took in what everyone was wearing and tried to determine where we are in the level of grooming and style. And we checked out how other people were acting, which families are still together, and which ones are sitting in different pews. And then we go home after window shopping like this, and maybe we have one thought. Today is Sunday. Today is a good day to be nice. Maybe, we think like that. Today is Sunday. So we had our good clothes on. So that reminded us. We had our Sunday go to meeting best on, and then we go home, and that's it. Shopping at the mall. I would hope that we could be a strong group, a strong sangha in changing that kind of idea. And the Buddhist path is really useful in that way because it is a continual method. It's not hit or miss. You don't just do it one day a week. You have a practice that you progress through. You have a mindfulness that you have to obtain. There are certain qualities that you must obtain in order to function as a bodhisattva, certain commitments that one makes. And it becomes a way of life in that rather than being like a puja or a church service or something like that, it is a living method, a living path. That's one of the things that I like best about it. That and the concern for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. But the trick is, it's really on an individual basis how each one of us will progress. And that has to be something that each and every one of us gets, because that is both a scary and deeply empowering thought. It would be nice if we could just take a religious pill and know that in a certain amount of time it would work, whatever that means. It would be nice that if we could do so many practices, we would know automatically 10 practices produces X amount of merit, reduces X amount of non-virtue. I wish it were that way. But the thing is, if you're just going through the practices by rote, why waste your time? Why bother? If these practices are not so meaningful to behold, that they are altering your life, your mind, your heart, everything about you, if you are not undergoing this path as a spiritual process, then it's as though, and I'll say it again, we're dressing up in our parents' clothing. It isn't a true path. And each of us have grappled with that in our own way. I know I have some students that really don't do a lot of sit-down practice. They just don't feel like that's their thing. And they don't feel like they can move through an entire Nundro and then go on to 3 roots and then go through the progression. They feel as well that It's just really too much for them to study the necessary practices in order to accomplish them properly. But these people are followers of the Buddha, and still they feel a strong commitment. So many of these people practice Buddhism on their feet. They practice it running, like our buddy over there. They practice it running, and I don't really object to that. I don't really object to that so long as they practice it in a heartfelt way. So long as they take in the Buddha's teaching and refuse to leave this world until they've made it a better place in some way or another. Then there are the others who are inclined towards the academic, that really want to study and really want to practice. And I'm really happy about that. I'm really proud of those people. I would love to see them go into retreat and really nail it. I'd love to see that kind of thing. But I would ask those practitioners, if that's what you're going to do, then do not exclude your ordinary life from your Buddhist practice. Live it and breathe it and have it be part of you, and work with yourself constantly to improve your qualities and to eliminate the poisons in our mind streams. The path is not just an interesting thing. It is a way of life. It is not just enough to study it and know how to do all the bells and whistles. There are bells, but there really aren't any whistles. Conch shells. We have conch shells. Longhorns. So it isn't really enough to just know how to do it and look good when you're doing it. No more than it's okay to go to church and just talk like a Christian one day of a week. It is a path, it is a method, and it should be all-pervasive. And if you're not willing to change into a more universal being, into a being filled with compassion, interested in morality and ethics, if you're not willing to change, this is not the path for you. Because change there must be. What we're asking for is enlightenment. We're asking for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. We're asking for the cessation of suffering. Look at the world around you. That's going to take some kind of radical change. Isn't it? But again, I refer you to the newspapers. So it's going to take such a radical change. Doesn't it seem reasonable and logical to you that that radical change has got to start with you? We talk about change. We talk about compassion. We talk about living a spiritual life. But very few of us actually accept that it starts here. That's a very difficult thing to understand. We let ourselves get away with thinking, oh, you know, we're helping the temple. We come and contribute sometimes. Sometimes we do some of the prayer shifts. We help to hold the 24-hour prayer vigil. Sometimes we give a little money. Sometimes we clean up a little bit. Sometimes we make some food here or something that we share with the Sangha. And we think, well, I've done my bit for the church. No, I'm sorry. Actually, I have to tell you that although I have been placed on this throne by my teacher, I'm not all that religious a person. But I'm really, really into spirituality. And so, for my way of thinking, I wouldn't care if you sounded like Dharma and looked like Dharma and knew all the Dharma words and knew all the Dharma concepts. I wouldn't be so impressed with that if I saw that you didn't know how to be kind, that you didn't know how to be generous, that you didn't know how to consider yourself potent as a spiritual being to the degree that where you are, you will hold the line on ethics, morality, and love. Where you are, these qualities will exist. If you can't promise yourself that, why be on a path? Then you're just collecting stuff. You're just doing something. You're going to the movies. You're shopping. It's nothing. It's just an ordinary activity then. So I wonder, and you must be wondering, how it is that we can manage to sensitize ourselves and begin to move away from that determination to be the center of the universe, from that self-absorption that, when we weren't Buddhists, was real easy to see. When we are Buddhists, is a little bit more hidden, but still our friend, still there with us. I would like to know how it is we're going to actually practice the Buddha's teachings. How are we going to do that? Well, like I've said, it's not going to happen accidentally. It's going to take a great deal of effort, concentration, concern, sincerity. When the Buddha teaches us the path, the Buddha teaches us, first of all, to examine the condition of all beings. And we've had many, many examples of those teachings, and lamas have come here and they've gone through the same words, turning the mind towards Dharma every time. Why do they do that every time? Do they think you're stupid? No. It's because it is the foundation of everything that comes after on the spiritual path, to understand the condition of all sentient beings, so that we can give rise to compassion finally and fully. So we are taught that all sentient beings, that all samsara, all that we experience, is pervaded with suffering. Suffering is all pervasive. And so that is meant to attune us to the fact that we're not the only ones with problems. But because we think we are. The minute we have a problem, everything else disappears in the whole world. So we're supposed to understand that samsara is pervaded with suffering, and we're supposed to understand that in their confusion, revolving endlessly around in this suffering, not suffering, suffering, not suffering, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In their endless wandering around like that, the only thing that all beings are trying to accomplish is some kind of happiness. That's it. Looks really different for all of this. I've said again and again, you might see someone that's a serial killer, but in their twisted, unhappy, unfortunate way, that moment of power and control they gain over someone else is the closest thing they've ever seen to happiness. And then you look at somebody else that tries to be happy through, well, what you were told would make you happy. At least 2 cars. At least one of them's red. I have a red car. It made me happy for about a month. So it does work temporarily. And 2 cars and a beautiful house and the best clothes and the best mate and the best children and the best, you know, all that kind of stuff. So we try to gain all of that. And then at some point, samsara wakes us up and says, "Hey, knucklehead, guess what? You've got all this, but you've also got old age, sickness, and death. And so has everybody else." And at some point, the grim reminder will come to us. And that's when we'll remember. But until that time, we are just sentient beings that are wandering in samsara, trying to gain happiness. All of us. I mean, think about that. It's like we're all kids in the same bathtub. You know? It's like here we are, we're all wandering in samsara, not understanding, trying to gain happiness. And in our nature, here's the magic part, we are exactly equal. So how are we going to practice that? How are we going? I mean, this is the thinking of a bodhisattva. When a bodhisattva decides what to do with their day, these are the factors that are in it. This is what happens. That's the kind of commitment that we are trying to give rise to here. And that is not the same as, putting on your Dharma clothes and taking your little Dharma books and your little Dharma beads and your little Dharma jewelry. I wore another kind of jewelry today. Little Dharma jewelry, and you just sort of go into your little Dharma room and do your little Dharma thing. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. That's you trying on your parents' clothes. So if we have to make some kind of deliberate effort towards sensitizing ourselves, towards really understanding the Buddha's teachings about impartiality and equanimity, if we are really going to adapt the inner posture of a bodhisattva, how are we going to sensitize ourselves? How are we going to do this? What are the mechanics? Now, of course, the traditional teachings give us all the thoughts that turn their mind towards Dharma, which we've taught again and again and again in this place. But let's take the thoughts that turn the mind towards Dharma and develop them a little bit, using terminology, using images that we can understand, so that our practice is not there written in a book somewhere, but it's in here. How are we going to do that? Well, my suggestion is this. First of all, we consider ourselves, for the most part, people in this room are Americans. If not Americans, then for the most part Westerners. But we do have, many different types in this room as well, many different types that are associated with our temple. But whatever it is that we consider ourselves, from that point, we should begin to branch out and deliberately exercise our capacity, first of all, to understand other cultures. It is necessary, I feel, in order, as a step along the way, in order to understand the sameness or the equality of all that lives, for us to learn a natural kind of love and respect for other peoples and other cultures. And the most excellent way to practice that would be to familiarize yourself so thoroughly that when you meet different peoples, different religions, different cultures, different colors, the first thing you notice is what is the same about you, rather than what is different. To be so familiar with a culture that you formerly, let's say, maybe even had prejudice toward. Everybody's got prejudice. We grew up with it. We ate it with our breakfast. So to familiarize yourself with another culture, another people, and to get into the really fun stuff. What makes them talk the way they do? What makes them think the way they do? There must be certain kinds of goals that were indigenous, or conditions that were indigenous in that place, perhaps a long time ago, that influenced that culture, and that culture evolved to answer those very needs and those questions. How amazing and fascinating that is, to learn that about all these different cultures. And because, well, my background, my heritage is that I'm half Italian and half Jewish. That's not really a nationality, I know, but it's complicated. Anyway. But that's what I'm a mutt, basically. And so that being the case, the tendency might be, the temptation might be great, first thing I'm going to do is explore the Italian culture so that I can get real nationalistic. Actually, I think that's about the worst thing to do, and I have avoided that. I have avoided that. I like something about the cultural things that I grew up with, and I like to cook the way I grew up and that sort of thing. But I really have made a diligent effort not to favor one people over another. And so an excellent way to do that is to become truly familiar with other cultures and other peoples and other religions as well. To become so familiar with them, it's almost like you're seeking them out or becoming familiar with them in the same way you would if you yourself were searching out your own roots. With the same kind of automatic acceptance. I mean, if I were to go and search out the cultural reality of Italians, just by virtue of the fact that I'm half Italian, I would be inclined to pretty much like everything they do. I would be inclined to see their best qualities. That's the posture that we should hold when we look at anyone and any place in the world. Now, all of us have known that this is what has to be done. In fact, well, since I live in Arizona and I get around under these conditions, I know something about the New Age community. And in the New Age community, especially in Arizona, everybody is hoping that the UFOs were going to come. And then when the UFOs come, they're going to break down all the national barriers because we're all going to have to band together and realize that the others are out there. Not out there, and there, and there, but out there. I think that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. To change the idea of the alien, or the foreigner, or the different one, or the unacceptable one, or the one you should have prejudice toward as being the guys out there, and thinking that will unify us. Give me a break. I don't think we should wait for that. Has this occurred to any of you? I think we should start without them. So what if we, each one of us, as Buddhists, as spiritual people, in our interfacing with the world, took that on, took on that responsibility and joy, because what can come out of it besides good? And became really familiar with other cultures, really familiar and aware that we also share this world with the animal kingdom. We seem to be forgetting that. We seem to be like building roads where animals are migrating and putting up dams where salmon are trying to get upstream and have babies. And we just aren't getting it. I mean, you know, if things were reversed, what if some big salmons came up and put up a road between, you know, put up a dam between you and your bed? I mean, I know that's a funny and crass way to look at it, but have you thought about it? We seem to be not even aware that we are living on a planet with other species. I mean, talk about non compos mentis. We also seem to be unaware that we are living on a planet with people, other people who are, while they're the same species, can have completely different ideas from us. Completely different ideas. And in our mind, it's almost like we can only stomach people that have ideas like us. It's very difficult. And so gradually I feel that each one of us should take responsibility for developing methods to become more and more familiar and more deeply aware of the equality of all that lives. I recommend becoming very familiar with as many different cultures as you can, to understand what motivates the people of these cultures, what their ideas are, what their fears are, what are their foods, what about their clothing? How did their clothing get to be that way? Maybe in some cultures the clothing was developed because of the environment. Maybe there's something interesting about the clothing that can, while when you first look at it you might think, what is that? You might look at, say, I don't know, an Indian sari and say, huh? But then when you really study how the idea of a sari came about and how it was developed that way, there are many actual cultural and environmental causes for that dress to have evolved the way it does. It's fascinating, completely fascinating. I'm suggesting as well that you get to know your planet. I mean, really get to know your planet. Some of us forget, we think we're walking on the floor. We just don't get the planet thing. We're walking on the floor. And not understanding that, we seem to be unable to do anything about the fact that our natural resources and our trees are going away. That these are things that lead to a dying planet. That in many places the water is no longer drinkable. And that may not reverse anytime soon. We need to be aware that we are living on this planet and to act accordingly. When you live in your house, do you clean the floor? Sometimes? Do you wash the dishes? Sometimes? You do manage your environment where you live. That's all I'm suggesting. Manage your environment where you live. In this way, if we practice the Buddha's teachings with that kind of loving concern, then even going on to learn about the reality of non-physical entities, to go on to learn that of all the ways that consciousness expresses itself, there are actually very few forms of consciousness that can practice the path and exit samsara. All these factors we need to internalize, not just hear it, not just think it, but internalize it in here. My sense is that in practicing this path, it should really move you. Why are we so sophisticated nowadays and so cool that we can't have a spiritual renaissance, a spiritual awakening? I mean, why are we so sophisticated and so urbane with our cigars and our martinis? Why are we so like that, that we can't awaken in some kind of really goofy way to love? I mean, why isn't it possible to look at another face, preferably one that doesn't look like yours? Maybe it's a different color. Maybe the eyes are shaped different. Maybe the language is different. And say, I love you. From the deepest part of our hearts, I know what you are. The Buddha has taught me, I know what you are. I know that you are the same as me. I know that you have hopes and fears just like I do. I know that we are inseparable. And I know that until you are free, I will never be happy. Why isn't it possible for us to be moved in that way? What's wrong with a spiritual awakening on an individual and even a group level happening in this day and at this time? To hell with fashion. Nowadays, the idea is that our lives are so compartmentalized. We should be very successful at work. We should be very successful at home. We should be very successful in religion. We should be very successful in collecting things. I'm talking about a different kind of life entirely, where there is no compartmentalization, where the most important thing for us to be is human, where the most important thing for us to be is responsible for the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, and moved to our cores. What's wrong with that? But I'm asking you, as my students and the ones who have the karma to hear these teachings, I'm asking you to be right there with it. To be a voice in a world where not everyone has a voice. To interface with your world in such a way as to make a difference. Why is it so inconceivable that we could see the end of hatred, bigotry, prejudice? Why can't we see that in this lifetime? Why isn't it possible? I've never really asked you as sincerely as I'm asking you now, as we prepare ourselves to cross into the new millennium. This is the year 2000 that we've been thinking about for so long. This is a big deal. Let's enter the new millennium as spiritual beings, as humans. There's no reason why we have to take the old crap with us. There's no reason why each one of us can't experience a spiritual rebirth. So I'm asking you to be a voice in this world. I'm asking you not to tolerate bigotry, not to tolerate prejudice, not to tolerate gossip and slander, not to tolerate hatred and greed. But kindly, in the most supporting and loving way you can, hold the line against that darkness. Hold the line.
Unto